All right, we're at the bottom of 15b, Tesvav Amud Beis. So we had on Friday, was it? Or Thursday? When were we? Thursday, Friday? Before Shabbos. The verse which describes where the earth for the Sotah water comes from. Right? The Sotah water has the water in the earthenware vessel. The earthenware vessel and water we discussed at length earlier. Fresh, new, how new, etc. It's got to be clean, but does it have to be absolutely new? Was it never used, and so on? Then there's earth, and then there is the scroll that's erased in it. So now we're talking about the earth. Now the verse, as we explained, has two phrasings to describe where the earth comes from, and each of those phrasings, if they were left alone, would mean something else. The first phrase is earth that is there. That would mean just take any earth as long as it's there. Doesn't matter where from. But then the other phrasing in the verse is from the ground of the Mishkan, implying you cannot get earth from anywhere else other than the ground in the Mishkan. So had it only said that first phrasing, take earth that's there, then just get any earth and put it in. Doesn't make a difference. But had the verse only said the words that's in the Mishkan, it's on the ground of the temple, then you would imagine that if the surface of the Mishkan has no earth, then dig until you find, because the verse says that's in the ground of the Mishkan. But because the verse says both, that's there and earth in the Mishkan, it tells us that it has to come from the ground of the Mishkan. And if there isn't any there, go outside, bring some earth, put it onto the ground of the Mishkan, and then take it and put it into the water. This is where we are right now.
So now, when did they state that they have to get the plate?
So the plate was just the plate they picked up was to access the earth.
Yeah.
Right? So they would pick that up, and if there's earth there, good, they would take it and put it in. If there's no earth there, they would go outside, take some earth, put it into that hole, and then pick it up. So that way they satisfy both parts of the verse. It's there in the Mishkan, but it's readily available. It doesn't have to be dug for. And if you have to dig for it, don't. Just go bring from outside and put it there, and then you have it. Yeah, clear? Okay. Now, the Gemara is going to introduce another Mishnaic text, which analyzes the same verse, but brings two conclusions to how to deal with this verse. One is the way we just reconciled it now, but then there's another way of reconciling the verse. So it ends up being a dispute, depending on how you understand these two phrasings in the verse. One way to understand is, as we just did, that it has to come from the ground of the Mishkan, and if there isn't any earth there, go bring earth, put it in the ground of the Mishkan and use it. But then there's another way of understanding these two phrasings, which we'll get to right now. So third to last line of the page. Tanya Idach. Hold on one second, I'm just going to close the door. All right, Tanya Idach. We have another Mishnah Gage text, which analyzes the same verse. And the verse begins, take from the earth, ashayiyah, that's available. Take the earth that's available. Now that phrasing, the Lamed teaches you, just take any earth from anywhere, outside, and bring it in and use it, because the verse just says, take earth that's available. Okay, so I'm taking any earth that's available from wherever. But then the next phrasing in the verse is, Bekarka Mishkan, that the earth has to come from the ground of the sanctuary. Okay, so how do you deal with that? How do you understand this phrasing? So here's where we get to the dispute. Isi ben Yehuda Omer, Isi son of Yehuda says, when the verse says to take earth from the ground of the sanctuary, it doesn't mean that the earth has to actually come from the ground of the sanctuary. In Isi ben Yehuda's view, you can take earth from anywhere, because the verse says, Ashayiyah, take earth that's available anywhere. Now, so why does the verse say this phrasing from the ground of the Mishkan? So explains that Isi ben Yehuda Lahavi, this comes to teach you, Karka Shilo. Now on the top of Tazayin Amud Aleph, go to 16a. Shilo Noi V'Givon Beis Almin, to teach you that not only is the earth that's in the surroundings or near the desert temple, but even as the temple travels and makes it to its final destination in Jerusalem, it's still considered valid. So when the verse says, exactly this phrasing is a discussion whether you include Sheila and Nuva given or not, but the point is made that we shouldn't think that Okay, let's rephrase this. So the verse says, take from the earth that's available. Now, this verse is speaking to the Jews that are in the desert, right? So one might have thought that you have to take earth that's available at the desert where the Mishkan is. Once the Mishkan gets transformed into the Mikdash, into the permanent sanctuary in Jerusalem, maybe the law no longer applies. Or maybe somehow you have to travel back to the desert and get the earth. I don't know. And therefore the verse says, take whatever's available at the ground of your temple, wherever the temple happens to be. But it's not coming to tell you that it has to actually come from the earth that's under the temple. It can come from anywhere. So in Isi ben Menachem's, in Isi ben Yehuda, right? Isi ben Yehuda? Yeah, in Isi ben Yehuda's view, the earth can come from anywhere. It can come from outside the temple. It doesn't have to come from the floor of the temple. So in Isi ben Yehuda's view, this whole idea of having a tablet, what's it called, a plate that they would lift and take earth, in Isi ben Yehuda's view, unnecessary. Take the earth from anywhere. As for the fact that the verse uses this phrasing from the ground of the temple, it's just coming to tell you that even as the temple moves to Jerusalem, it's still valid. But it doesn't mean that it has to actually come from the earth that's under the actual temple. This is Isi ben Yehuda's view, which is obviously different than what we just learned last week.
We can't figure out how we can get earth in the desert. It's all sand.
Okay, sand. I don't. Earth. I don't know that earth means. I don't know that earth comes to exclude sand. I think it means
Ground.
ground. Yeah, like just universal, any ground, including sand.
But from what I'm understanding from
Yeah.
this is we want to use whatever earth or sand or whatever we want to use.
Yeah.
Is because if you're taking ground from the temple, or
Yeah.
you're taking, or even if it's or even if it's traveling, the ground around it has blood and water mixed into it
From
cleaning of the.
maybe.
So I'm understanding is you want to use ground.
That's a good point, but in the temple, it would have been the case.
Well, they're bringing a sacrifice.
Right, but in the temple, they had a draining system which would have drained it all out. In the desert, you might have been right, where like the blood and the thing would have spilled onto the floor on the ground.
Right.
But in the temple in Jerusalem, they had a marble floor with a whole drainage system. So the earth underneath the marble wouldn't have been cut, wouldn't have
Wouldn't have had that.
I don't think so. Wouldn't have had it. That's an interesting thought, though.
That's what comes to
Yeah.
mind. Why would it have to be?
So maybe that's why the verse had to include and say, even though the one in the temple in Jerusalem is not going to have the blood mixed, nonetheless, it's still good. Maybe that's what the verse is kind of saying, perhaps. Yeah. Anyway, so this opinion is not the opinion we said till now. The opinion we said till now is that it has to actually come from the ground of the temple, but you can bring it from outside, put it into the ground, and then use it. That was the opinion we said last week. Now we're giving a different opinion. The earth can come from anywhere. As for the fact that the verse uses this phrasing from the ground of the temple, it's only there to tell you that even as you move to Jerusalem, it's still valid.
So also coming from anywhere, meaning the traveling that you came
Exactly.
from anywhere.
Exactly. But this same Mishnaic text tells us the author of the opinion we learned on Friday. Isi ben Menachem Omer, Isi son of Menachem says, Einei tzarech. You don't need to have a verse to teach you that the temple in Jerusalem is valid. That was Isi ben Yehuda's view. Isi ben Yehuda's view is that the earth can come from anywhere. As for the fact that the verse uses this phrasing from the ground of the temple, it's coming to tell you that the temple in Jerusalem is also valid. Isi ben Menachem says you don't need a verse to do that. Obviously, it's going to be valid. It's God's temple. Proof. Uma tumma. Kala. When it comes to a lesser impurity, someone entering the temple impure, it's a prohibition. It's a prohibition. One is not allowed to enter the temple impure. So loy cholak akosov, the Torah does not make any distinction between the temple in the desert and the temple in Jerusalem. The prohibition stands equally. Right? There's a prohibition not to enter the temple impure, and the Torah says this prohibition is universal. Whether we're talking about the temple in Israel, whether we're talking about the temple in the desert, whether we're talking about the temple in Jerusalem, the prohibition to enter the temple impure is a universal rule. So we see this notion of universality. So Batumas Eshes Ish, here we're talking about a very, very strict level of impurity, a woman who's suspected of infidelity. So Chamura, which is much more stringent, much worse than someone entering the temple impure. Like Kol Sheken, is it not therefore obvious that the verse would not distinguish and say that the rule applies universally to whatever, regardless of which temple it is? So you don't need to have a verse to tell you, following? We don't need the verse to tell you a special verse to teach you that the temple in Jerusalem is also valid. You don't need that because we know from Torah already that the Torah does not distinguish between the temple in Jerusalem and the temple in the desert. It works universally. Where do we see that the Torah treats it universally? With respect to the prohibition of entering the temple impure. There's a prohibition to enter the temple impure, and that prohibition is universal, whether we're talking about the temple in Jerusalem or the temple in the desert. So if when it comes to entering the temple, Torah says it's prohibited no matter what temple you're talking about, whether in Jerusalem or desert, so then when it comes to treating a woman of a suspected infidelity, how the more so the temples are equal, whether we're talking about temple in Jerusalem or temple in the desert. And therefore, there's no need for the verse to teach you that the temple in Jerusalem is valid. We know it already. So if that's the case, so why does the verse come and say the karka mishkan, that the earth of the mishkan, right? Isi ben Yehuda used that phrasing, the earth of the mishkan, to teach you that even the temple in Jerusalem is valid. Isi ben Menachem is arguing the fact that the temple in Jerusalem is valid. I already know. I don't need a verse to teach me that. So what is the verse saying when it says to take from the earth of the mishkan? So this is the view of, we learned on Friday, he should not take earth from his box and put it directly into the water. Rather, he should put it onto the ground of the mishkan and then pick it up and put it into the water. Clear? So it all comes down to this. In other words, the verse is Ashayiyah, take earth that's available. From the fact that the verse says take earth that's available, we know you don't have to dig for it. It's got to be easily available. Good. But then the verse says, take from the ground that's in the temple. What does that mean? If it's readily available, maybe, meaning if it has to be from the earth of the temple, maybe it's not so readily available. But the verse said take that which is readily available. So what do? Okay. So Isa ben Yehuda says, take the earth that's readily available, even if it's outside the temple. The verse said take from the temple. That's just to tell you that the temple in Jerusalem is valid. Isa ben Menachem says the temple in Jerusalem is valid anyway. You don't need a verse. The fact that the verse says take from the earth of the temple means make sure you're taking it from the ground of the temple. And therefore, even if you're bringing the readily available earth from outside, put it from the ground of the temple and then use it. And that was the view we had on Friday. Okay. A few more lines? Yeah? Let me see if my name there. A few more lines. So Gemara asked the following inquiry. Not a challenge, but an inquiry. Right? I mean, I think I've said this before, but depending on the way the Gemara introduces a question, you know if it's a challenge or an inquiry. Sometimes the Gemara will use such a language of a question, and it informs that the question is about to ask is a challenge. But when the Gemara asks, when the Gemara uses the words ibaya, it's an inquiry, meaning the person who's asking doesn't have an agenda, just wants to know, just have no idea. So the following question was posed to the sages. We don't know what the law is. Tell us. Ein sham afar, if no earth is available, ma'u sheyitin efer, can they use ashes? Can they use like dust created by ashes? Does that also count as earth? Right. So sand is definitely part of earth, but the question is if this is considered earth. Now, why would I think it is? So says the Gemara, you should know there's a dispute between Shammai and Hillel with respect to the law of covering blood of an animal that's been slaughtered, right? If you've gone to Kaparas, if you know what I'm talking about, there's a mitzvah to bury the blood of the animal. The details of the mitzvah is not important now, but there is such a mitzvah. So you have to take earth and cover the blood of the animal. Okay.
You have to know immediately, because
It's supposed to be done
in Kapara, they just gather it in bales.
No, they slaughter it. Yeah, the blood comes right there, and you pour it right on.
No,
Sure.
we go to the garage over here.
Yeah.
And it's got funnels.
No, before he does that,
They slaughter it and they right away. They put it
no, before he does that, he pours the blood onto a little section with earth, and then you take another earth and you put it on top. That's what should have happened.
From what I recall, and I've only done this.
It's the blood that comes right from the moment of slaughter is actually poured right onto the ground, onto like a pile of earth, and you take a different pile of earth and you put it on top. Because the other blood already doesn't count. Well, remind me, I'll point it out to you. Sorry? Which garage? At Zirkin's?
Yeah, Zirkin.
Yeah, they do that. Maybe this past year because of COVID they weren't doing it, but they
last
do.
year, no, yeah, last year they
Because of COVID they were taking it. They didn't want touching things. But usually that's the case. The blood that comes out at the moment of slaughter or fall is like they pour it to a designated area onto like a pile of earth. You take a different pile of earth and put it on top and make the bracha. Okay,
Yeah.
so there's a dispute between the houses of Shammai and Hillel whether you're allowed to use ashes for that, whether you have to use earth or ashes. So the Gemara asks, Ali b'debei Shammai, following the view of Shammai, loy tiboyalach. I'm not even asking you if you can use ashes for the Sotah, because because Shammai is of the view that when it comes to the law of covering the blood, like matzinu efer shakari afar, we don't see that ashes is referred to as dust or earth, and therefore in Shammai's view, ashes and earth are not the same thing, even though they sound very similar. Afar efer, and one's with an aleph, one's with an ayin, they sound very similar, but they're not the same thing. So Shammai says you cannot use ashes to cover the blood of an animal, and if you can't use ashes to cover the blood of an animal, because Shammai is of the view that ashes is not the same thing as dirt, and certainly you can't use it for the Sotah waters. Okay, but Kitzi Boilach, when do we ask this question about whether you're allowed to use ashes for the Sotah? Aliba the Beis Hillel, following the view of Hillel. The Amri, because Hillel is of the view, Matzinu Efer Shekare Afar. We find that there are certain times in Scripture, or at least one time in Scripture, where the verse uses the language of ashes, Efer, to describe dust. Or the reverse, the verse uses the language afer, dust, to describe ashes. So
doesn't it say in scripture, ashes to ashes and dust to dust?
Right. So the verse that Hillel cites to is, the verse uses when describing the dust, the ashes of the red heifer. The verse uses the language of dust. So we see that ashes is referred to as dust. So because ashes is referred to as dust, therefore, Hillel says you can use the dust, the ashes to cover the blood.
Would also refer to as dust.
Yeah, when we return to dust.
That's what I mean.
At the moment, not yet.
No.
I know, but the question is if ashes is referred to as dust. Is ashes referred to as dust? If ashes is referred to as dust, then you can use ashes for covering the animal, covering the blood.
But only or
because the verse uses the language with respect to the red heifer. The red heifer is definitely ashes, right? Because they burn down this whole structure with the animal. It's definitely ashes. But the verse refers to those ashes as dust. So if the verse refers to ashes as dust, then you can use ashes to cover the blood, because ashes is referred to as dust. So the question becomes, does that same rule apply to the Sotah? And that's what the Gemara is asking. What's the law? Even though the verse refers to ashes as dust, and therefore you can use ashes to cover the blood of the animal. Hacha over here, with respect to the Sotah, perhaps you can't use the ashes because bekarka mishkan, because the verse uses the language of the karka, the ground of the temple. The word ground definitely excludes ashes. So even if the word dust includes ashes, the word ground definitely excludes ashes. So even if you're taking the view of Hillel, which says that ashes is referred to as dust, and therefore you can use the ashes to cover the blood of the animal. But over here, the verse doesn't just say dust. The verse even says ground, and ashes definitely doesn't come from the ground. Oidilma, or perhaps, no, we could use ashes. Hi, bekarka mishkan, but the verse says that you have to have the ground of the mishkan. That is not coming to tell you that the earth has to actually come from the ground, but rather, Isi ben Yehuda, you can use look at the Isi ben Menachem Udasi, that perhaps the words ground of the Mishkan is coming to teach you either like the law of Isi ben Yehuda, that you have to take the dust, put it on the ground, and then use it, or it's coming to teach you like Isi ben Menachem, that the temple ground in Jerusalem is also valid. So if that's why if that's what the verse, if these words, the ground of the Mishkan, is coming to teach you that you have to either put it on the ground and then use it, or even the ground of the temple is valid, then that means you could still use ashes. Take the ashes, put it on the ground, or take the ashes and put it in because you're using the temple, right? In other words, like this, we want to suggest that the reason why you can't use ashes for dust by the Sotah is because the verse says ground. But we just finished learning in another text that the word ground of the Mishkan has nothing to do with actual earth. It has to do with where you pick the thing up from, or it has to tell you that the temple is still valid. If that's the case, then the ground of the Mishkan does not preclude ashes. And thus, we're stuck with this conundrum. Does the word ground of the Mishkan mean it's got to be ground? It cannot be ashes. Or does ground of the Mishkan mean just telling you where you're picking it up from? That doesn't mean it excludes ashes, because I can take ashes, put it on the ground of the Mishkan, and then put it in. Or just
ashes put on the ground, it becomes part of the ground.
Yeah, or just do that. Or do I say, no. The verse uses the language ground. It's got to be ground. And this is the Gemara's inquiry as to whether or not ashes is valid. So according to Shammai, which says that ashes is never considered dust, which is why he says you cannot use ashes for the blood of the Mishkan. Certainly you can't use ashes for the Sotah. But according to Hillel, which says ashes is referred to as dust, and the question is only whether the language ground of the Mishkan is teaching you specifically ground, or is it just telling you location? And if the word ground of the Mishkan is telling you location, then maybe you could use ashes. And this is the Gemara's inquiry. And God willing, tomorrow we'll see how the Gemara tries to resolve this inquiry and goes back and forth. And we'll see at the end whether you can indeed use ashes for the Sotah. Hope that was clear. Sorry?
Wouldn't it be easier to use sand?
It's a hypothetical. It would have been much, of course, it's easier. I don't know if this question has any practical ramification. In reality, like I wonder if there's ever a time when they didn't have any earth available. Just walk down the street, get earth. I mean, but it seems like it's hypothetical. It's hypothetical. What would the law allow it in theory? If practically in reality they ever had to rely on this law, I doubt it. I mean, earth is always available, right? From somewhere. Okay, wonderful day.
The two, well, I think they're waiting.